the news spread across the world like wildfire. A new pope had been chosen. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out, their toll echoing through every television screen, radio broadcast, and smartphone, reverberating in the hearts of millions. This wasn't just another event. This was a moment that seemed to shift the very fabric of time. But for some, those who looked deeper, this was more than just a religious milestone. It was a sign. As the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square, the announcement of the new leader resonated in a way that felt different. It wasn't merely a name. It was a symbol of something much larger, something more profound. The selection of this new pope, seen by many as a new chapter for the Catholic Church, was also a direct echo of an ancient prophecy, one that was foretold decades ago by Edgar Cayce, a man known as the Sleeping Prophet. Cayce's words, though long forgotten by most, were still held closely by a select few who understood their true weight. In one of his lesser-known prophecies, Cayce had spoken of a moment when a spiritual leader would rise, signaling the beginning of a monumental shift, not just in religion, but in the very hearts and souls of humanity. He claimed that this event would primarily affect those over 60, a generation who would find themselves facing a choice, a deep inner transformation. But as the bells rang and the new pope's name echoed through the media, most people dismissed this as nothing more than coincidence. After all, history had seen such events before. Yet for those who had been paying attention to the whispers of the past, the moment felt eerily familiar. This wasn't just about a new pope. It was about a turning point in human consciousness. Cayce had predicted that the arrival of a new spiritual leader would not bring about disaster or destruction, but rather it would be the beginning of an inner awakening, a profound call for a generation to reassess their values, their beliefs, and their place in the world. It wasn't just a shift in leadership, but a shift in the very fabric of reality itself. For those over 60, this was a time not for fear, but for clarity. They would soon be faced with the challenge of confronting their past, understanding their purpose, and deciding whether to awaken to a deeper truth or remain trapped in fear and uncertainty. As the world watched, unaware of the deeper currents beneath the surface, one thing was certain. This was not just the start of a new pope's reign. It was the beginning of something far more significant. And for the elderly, the time to choose was now. Edgar Cayce, often referred to as the Sleeping Prophet, was a man whose insights and prophecies reached far beyond the bounds of traditional thinking. His ability to tap into a deeper source of knowledge, often while in a trance-like state, led to countless predictions about the future, some of which have yet to unfold. But among his many predictions, one stood out as particularly poignant, especially in light of the recent election of a new pope. Cayce, though not widely recognized by the mainstream, had a distinct connection to the unseen realms, a gift that allowed him to foresee global events. One of his most intriguing prophecies revolved around a time when a major shift in spiritual leadership would occur, signaling the beginning of a new era. But what made this prophecy so unsettling was the way Cayce described the timing. It would not be a grand, immediate disaster, but rather a subtle, transformative change that would primarily affect those over 60. A generation that had lived through wars, revolutions, and the rapid transformations of the 20th century, yet had never faced a shift of this magnitude. In his readings, Cayce spoke of a moment when humanity, especially the elderly, would find themselves at a crossroads. It wasn't just about a changing of the guard within the church. It was a harbinger of something far deeper. He suggested that this spiritual change would ignite a profound inner awakening, an emotional and intellectual reckoning for those who had lived long lives, yet had never truly questioned the foundations of their beliefs. The prophecy spoke of an awakening that would ripple through the older generation, urging them to confront the things they had buried for decades: regrets, unspoken fears, and unresolved emotions. Cayce believed that, at this stage in life, individuals would be forced to reevaluate their purpose, not in terms of external achievements, but in terms of their internal alignment with the universe. It would be a time of reckoning, but also a time of great opportunity. He also warned that this period would bring discomfort. The comfort of old beliefs would start to fade, leaving behind a feeling of emotional emptiness. Traditional faith, once a pillar of support for many, would no longer offer the answers it once did. Cayce suggested that this spiritual crisis would not be caused by external forces, but rather by a deep internal change within each person, especially those over 60. He likened this to an inner call, a summons to recognize that the meaning of life transcends the traditional frameworks that had shaped their worldview for decades. But it wasn't just about confronting the discomfort. Cayce also saw this as an opportunity for profound spiritual growth. In his readings, he described the possibility of finding a new kind of peace, one that could only be attained after a lifetime of experiences. For those who were ready to listen, to go beyond the surface level of their beliefs and values, this awakening could lead to a new level of understanding, a deeper connection to their soul, to the cycles of life, and to the universe itself. This would not be a change imposed by the outside world. It would be an inward revolution, quietly and steadily sweeping through the older generation. Cayce warned that many would resist this change, clinging to their old ways, and in doing so, they would face an increasing sense of disconnection and suffering. But for those who were willing to embrace this spiritual shift, the rewards would be far greater. The moment the new pope was chosen, the echoes of Cayce's prophecy became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just the selection of a new leader, it was a symbol, a sign that the time had come for a spiritual reawakening. The new pope, with his gentle but firm leadership, could very well be the figure that marks the beginning of this long-predicted transformation. For those over 60, the prophecy was clear. The time had come to choose. Would they resist the change and remain trapped in the past? Or would they awaken to a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them? The world had changed, and it was now up to them to decide how they would respond to the call of the future. The election of the new pope, though largely seen as a religious event, quietly marked the beginning of something much deeper, especially for those over 60. It was a moment that seemed to reverberate through their souls, awakening a long-buried awareness. For many, the realization came slowly, almost imperceptibly. The world around them had changed, but the changes within themselves were even more profound. As the elderly watched the announcement unfold, something stirred within them. They had lived through decades of societal upheaval, wars, and technological advancements that had reshaped the very fabric of life. Yet in all those years, they had never been forced to confront the existential questions that were now rising to the surface. Cayce's prophecy was becoming real, not in the way some might have expected, but in a far more personal and internal way. For many older individuals, this moment wasn't about the Pope's election alone. It was a quiet, internal signal that their time of reckoning had arrived. They were no longer just watching the world change around them. They were being asked to change from within. The weight of their years, their experiences, their accumulated wisdom all came to a head. The external changes, like the selection of a new spiritual leader, only served to amplify the internal shifts they were already feeling. This internal shift wasn't without its challenges. For some, it was uncomfortable to begin questioning their long-held beliefs. For decades, their faith had been a steady anchor in the storms of life. But now, that anchor seemed to be loosening. What had once been an unwavering certainty was now a source of doubt. The sense of security that had come from a familiar set of beliefs was fading, replaced by an unsettling feeling of disconnection. And yet, this discomfort was not necessarily a bad thing. It was, in fact, the beginning of the spiritual awakening Cayce had predicted. This was a time for the elderly to look inward, to confront their deepest fears, regrets, and unresolved emotions. For many, this process was difficult. It meant revisiting old wounds, regrets from the past, and moments where they had failed to live up to their own expectations. But in doing so, they began to peel back the layers that had accumulated over the years, revealing a more authentic self beneath. For others, this awakening came as a quiet relief. The pressure of living up to societal expectations, the burden of constantly trying to keep up with a rapidly changing world, began to dissipate. The realization that it was okay to let go of old beliefs, to embrace uncertainty, was liberating. They didn't need to have all the answers anymore. What mattered was that they had lived, and now, in their later years, they had the opportunity to reconnect with their true essence. This was the moment Cayce had described, the time when the elderly could begin to access a new kind of wisdom, one that came not from external sources but from deep within their own souls. The shift wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always easy. But for those willing to face the discomfort, the rewards were immense. It was a time of reconnection, not just with the world, but with themselves. And for many, it was the beginning of the most profound spiritual journey they had ever known. As the world absorbed the announcement of the new pope, the impact was felt differently by those who had been attuned to Edgar Cayce's prophecies. For most, it was simply the election of a new leader, someone who would guide the spiritual flock. But for those who had been quietly waiting, the choice of this pope was more than just a religious milestone. It was the moment when Cayce's long-forgotten words began to make sense. The twist, which had been buried in the recesses of Cayce's predictions, now began to reveal itself. The election wasn't a random event. It wasn't just the selection of a new figurehead. It was the fulfillment of a much deeper spiritual blueprint. Cayce had foretold that the arrival of a new spiritual leader would trigger an internal shift, not just for the world, but particularly for those over 60, those who were at the cusp of the final stages of their life's journey. This pope, with his calm demeanor and methodical approach, was not simply a caretaker of religious traditions. He was the embodiment of a deeper spiritual transformation that the older generation was about to experience. Cayce had spoken of a significant spiritual transition, one that would affect the elderly in ways they had not anticipated. This wasn't about the world ending or any catastrophic event unfolding. No, Cayce's words were more subtle and yet infinitely more profound. It was about an awakening that could not be ignored, an awakening to a deeper understanding of one's own existence, visible change in the world, but there was something different in the air, something intangible. It was as if time itself had shifted gears, and those who had lived long enough to feel the subtle changes could sense that a new era was upon them. The new pope wasn't merely a figure of authority, he was a catalyst, a symbol of spiritual renewal that was now being offered to the older generation. But to grasp it, they had to be willing to look inward and confront the inner truths that they had long ignored. For some, this was a moment of clarity. The connection between the election and Cayce's prophecy was undeniable. They had heard the whispers all their lives, but now the prophecy was unfolded before them. The church's new leader was the spiritual representative of this era of change. It wasn't just about religion, it was about the deeper internal transformation that was being catalyzed by his leadership. The elderly were being invited to look beyond the surface and delve into the depths of their own souls, to examine the choices they had made, and to decide if they were ready to awaken to a new understanding of life. But there was also a sense of fear. Many, accustomed to the certainty and security that their traditional beliefs provided, felt the weight of discomfort creeping in. Cayce had predicted this moment, a time when the elderly would be forced to confront their deepest fears, their regrets, and their sense of disconnection. But with that discomfort came an opportunity to heal and awaken to a higher purpose. As the days passed, more and more people over 60 began to feel the pull. The change was not just about the new pope, it was about their own spiritual awakening. They realized that their role in the world was far more significant than they had ever imagined. They weren't just aging, they were evolving. The new pope, acting as a quiet symbol of this transition, was offering them a mirror, a chance to reflect on their lives and see beyond the surface level of their experiences. The spiritual awakening that Cayce had foreseen was happening now, and it was up to them to embrace it. For those willing to listen, the path forward was clear. The time for resistance was over. The inner transformation that awaited them was not to be feared, but embraced. The connection between the election and the prophecy was no longer a mystery. It was a call to action. And for those who heeded the call, the rewards would be immense. Peace, clarity, and a deeper connection with their true selves. As the world continued to turn, the elderly were no longer passive observers. They were active participants in the spiritual shift, and their journey was just beginning. As the weeks passed since the election of the new pope, a quiet but profound transformation began to take shape within the older generation. Those over 60 who had felt the stirrings of change now stood at a crossroads. The discomfort that had initially risen within them when old beliefs began to crumble was no longer something to fear. Instead, it had become the gateway to something new, something deeply liberating. The internal awakening, once a mere whisper, had now turned into a call that could no longer be ignored. The choices were clear. They could continue clinging to old ways, resisting the changes within themselves, or they could embrace this moment as the opportunity for profound growth. The election of the new pope had been the spark, but now the responsibility lay with them. This was their time to decide whether they would remain tethered to the past or step forward into a new spiritual understanding. For many, the path forward wasn't one of grand gestures or dramatic actions. Instead, it was a series of small, quiet decisions, moments of reflection, deep introspection, and acceptance. It wasn't about abandoning their past or their traditions. It was about understanding that those traditions no longer served them in the same way. They were being called to look beyond the surface, to peel away the layers of unexamined beliefs, and to reconnect with a deeper, more authentic self. For some, This journey was marked by simple acts, revisiting old memories, writing letters to loved ones, or spending quiet moments in nature. These were not insignificant acts. They were the means through which the elderly began to understand their own spiritual essence. The path forward required them to sit with their regrets, to acknowledge their mistakes, and to forgive themselves for the things they had carried for so long. The burden of unresolved feelings began to lighten as they allowed themselves to release old wounds and embrace a new perspective on life. The discomfort that once felt like a threat was now a companion, guiding them toward a deeper understanding of their existence. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the questions seemed endless, and the answers, if they came at all, felt elusive. But for those who were willing to confront their fears, to sit in the discomfort, there was an undeniable sense of clarity that began to emerge. Each day became a small victory, a moment closer to the peace that had eluded them for so long. This wasn't a journey that could be rushed. The elderly were not expected to have all the answers, nor were they asked to abandon everything they had known. Instead, they were being invited to reconnect with their inner truth, to embrace the wisdom that only a lifetime of experience could bring. The path forward was one of self-discovery, of rediscovering their own sense of purpose and meaning, not through external validation, but through an internal awakening. For those who chose this path, the rewards were immeasurable. There was a sense of peace, a quiet knowing that despite the years behind them, they still had a vital role to play in the world. This new understanding wasn't about what they had done, but about what they could still do. The elderly were not simply witnesses to the world around them, they were active participants in shaping the future, starting with their own inner transformation. As the journey continued, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The path forward was one of constant growth, of living with intention and embracing the quiet wisdom that comes with age. For those who walk this path, the future held a promise, not of perfection, but of deep spiritual peace. And in that peace, they would find their place in the world, not as passive observers, but as guides for those who would follow. As time passed, the subtle yet powerful transformation that had begun with the election of the new pope continued to unfold within the hearts and minds of the older generation. What had once been a vague sense of discomfort, a distant whisper of change, had now become an undeniable force, an awakening. For those who had allowed themselves to embrace the spiritual journey, the path ahead was no longer filled with confusion or uncertainty. It was clear now. This was their moment to fully step into the wisdom and peace that had long eluded them. The process hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, nights of restlessness, and times when the weight of past regrets seemed too heavy to bear. But through it all, those who had chosen to listen to the call of their inner selves found that each step, no matter how small, led them closer to a place of profound peace. This peace wasn't the kind of tranquility that came from external circumstances. It was a quiet, deep-rooted calm that arose from within. The elderly who had embarked on this journey of awakening found themselves shedding layers of old fears, outdated beliefs, and unspoken guilt. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the process of introspection became more natural, more fluid. It was no longer a forced effort, but rather a way of being. Every moment became an opportunity for self-reflection, for revisiting the past with compassion and understanding. The rigid walls they had built around themselves over the years began to crumble, and in their place, a newfound openness emerged. One of the most profound shifts occurred in their relationship with the world around them. They had spent so much of their lives conforming to societal expectations, clinging to old roles, and measuring their worth by external achievements. But now, the world seemed to hold a different meaning. The relentless pursuit of success, the constant striving to be more, was replaced by a deep appreciation for what was already present in their lives. They began to savor the small moments, the quiet mornings, the conversations with loved ones, the simple act of breathing in the air. It was as if their entire perspective on life had shifted, and in this shift, they found a new sense of purpose. This awakening wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was also about embracing the future with open arms. The elderly, who had once felt disconnected from the world around them, now understood that they still had a role to play. They weren't relics of a bygone era, fading into the background. They were active participants in the ongoing journey of humanity. Their wisdom, gained through decades of experience, was now a source of strength, not just for themselves, but for those younger than them. The new Pope, with his calm presence and thoughtful leadership, had been the catalyst for this transformation. His election had triggered something deeper in the older generation, a realization that their lives still had purpose, that they could still evolve, and that their spiritual journey was far from over. He was a living symbol of the change they were undergoing, and his leadership served as a reminder that spiritual growth wasn't bound by age or circumstance. In his example, they saw that it was never too late to begin again, never too late to awaken. The final awakening was marked by a profound sense of clarity. It wasn't about finding all the answers or understanding every mystery of life. It was about accepting the journey as it was and trusting that in the end, everything had unfolded exactly as it should. The elderly who had embraced this transformation no longer lived in fear of the future. They no longer measured their lives by what they had done or what they had failed to do. They had found peace in the present moment, and in this peace, they discovered a freedom they had never known before. As they looked forward, they saw not an end, but a new beginning. The years ahead weren't a decline, but a continuation of their spiritual journey, a journey that would continue to unfold with each passing day. And though their physical bodies might grow older, their souls had been renewed. The process of awakening had not only transformed their inner world, but it had also reconnected them to the world around them. In this final stage of life, they had found a new sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of their place in the universe, and a quiet, powerful peace that would guide them through the years to come. For those who had awakened, the journey was never truly over. It was simply a new chapter, one where the wisdom of the past and the possibilities of the future coexisted in perfect harmony. The final awakening was not just the culmination of their spiritual journey. It was the beginning of their truest self.